Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The wind whistled through the cracks of Ezekiel Harmon's workshop on the edge of Clearwater County, Minnesota. Outside, the winter of 1908 settled in with a vindictive cold that made men hurry between buildings with collars pulled high and hands buried deep in pockets. Inside, the 53-year-old carpenter hunched over his workbench, methodically filing a notch into a small metal contraption that bore little resemblance to the heavy steel traps the other hunters in the region used. The lantern light caught on the simple mechanism, a pair of lightweight jaws connected to a small spring and trigger system that Harmon had spent 3 winters perfecting. The other trappers had mocked him openly at Burkhardt's general store when he'd tried explaining his design. Too small to hold anything worth catching, Jackson Thorpe had declared, to the approving nods of the others gathered around the pot-bellied stove. Hunting ain't about toys, Harmon. It's about strength. The laughter that followed had stung, but Ezekiel simply tucked his sketches back into his coat pocket and continued purchasing his supplies. 20 years of frontier living had taught him that preparation mattered more than bravado, and careful design trumped brute force. What the others couldn't understand was that Ezekiel wasn't trying to make a trap like theirs. He was solving a problem they didn't recognize. The heavier the trap, the more equipment a man had to carry, and the fewer lines he could set in a day. Traditional traps were also notoriously unreliable, with animals often escaping or, worse, partially caught and suffering. His stop thief trap, as he'd named it, was designed to work differently, catching the animal quickly and humanely with less material and weight. In the 3 months since that day at the store, Ezekiel had finished his first dozen traps. Each weighed less than half what the standard Newhouse models did, with an innovative trigger mechanism that would snap shut with just the right amount of pressure. But the true test would come with the first snow, when the winter trapping season began in earnest. Ezekiel carefully wrapped his completed traps in burlap and placed them in his storage chest, wondering if his invention would validate his approach or simply provide more ammunition for the mockery he'd endured. The roots of Ezekiel's innovation ran deeper than mere technical improvement. His journey to Clearwater County had begun 23 years earlier, when he arrived as a 30-year-old journeyman carpenter from Pennsylvania, seeking opportunity in the expanding frontier. Unlike many who came west with dreams of quick fortune, Ezekiel brought with him a craftsman's patience and a habit of careful observation. These qualities had served him well through the harsh realities of frontier settlement, the brutal winters, the isolation, and the constant need for self-reliance. His first Minnesota winter had nearly killed him. Arriving too late in the season to properly prepare, he'd survived on the charity of established homesteaders who recognized in the young carpenter a valuable skill set worth preserving. The experience had impressed upon him a lesson he never forgot. In frontier country, inadequate preparation wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Every winter thereafter, Ezekiel prepared with a thoroughness that became legendary among his neighbors, some of whom found his caution excessive. Man could survive 3 winters on what Harmon puts by for 1 was a common jest at Burkhardt's. Yet Ezekiel continued his methodical ways, observing how others struggled when conditions turned unexpectedly severe, noting what worked and what failed, and adjusting his own practices accordingly. His interest in trap design had emerged gradually, though not primarily a trapper by trade. Ezekiel, like most frontier settlers, supplemented his income and food supply through seasonal hunting. Over the years, he'd noticed the limitations of existing trap designs, their weight, their unreliability, and the damage they often caused to valuable pelts. With a craftsman's eye, he began considering how these tools might be improved, sketching ideas during the long winter evenings when carpentry work was scarce. The winter of 1908-1909 began with unusual severity. By early December, the thermometer outside the Clearwater County Courthouse hadn't risen above zero for 11 consecutive days. The cold was accompanied by heavy snow that buried fence posts and made travel between homesteads treacherous. Most trappers delayed setting their lines, waiting for more favorable conditions. But Ezekiel saw opportunity in the harsh weather. With fewer competitors venturing out and animals growing desperate for food as the cold deepened, he would have the advantage of being first on the ground. Before dawn on December 14th, Ezekiel set out with a pack considerably lighter than those of other trappers. While men like Jackson Thorpe laboriously hauled 50-pound packs containing only a dozen heavy traps, Ezekiel carried 30 of his lightweight devices, along with ample bait and supplies for a 3-day journey. His route took him north along Beaver Creek, through stands of pine and birch that offered shelter to the marten, mink, and fox that fetched the highest prices from the fur buyers who traveled through at the end of each season. 3 sets to their 1, he muttered to himself as he carefully positioned his 7th trap of the morning, using a small brush to sweep snow over the mechanism until only the bait was visible. That's how the math works out. Ezekiel had mapped his entire route, calculating distances and optimal placement locations, something the other trappers considered unnecessary fussing. To them, trapping was about instinct and strength. To Ezekiel, it was about systematic efficiency and understanding the behavior of the animals he sought. The creek gurgled softly beneath a thin layer of ice, the sound barely audible over the whisper of wind through the bare branches above. Ezekiel knelt to examine tracks in the fresh snow, the delicate imprints of a marten that had passed through some time during the night. With practiced precision, he selected a location where 2 fallen logs created a natural funnel, placing his trap where the animal would naturally step. Unlike the heavy steel jaws of traditional traps, which required careful concealment and elaborate triggers, Ezekiel's lightweight design could be set quickly and would activate with minimal disturbance of the surrounding area. As he worked, memories of his first attempts at trapping surfaced. The frustration of finding empty traps, the disappointment of damaged pelts, the weight of traditional equipment that limited how much ground he could cover. Each failure had been a lesson, each success a confirmation that there were better ways to work with, rather than against, the natural patterns of the forest and its inhabitants. By midday, Ezekiel had placed 15 traps, each location carefully noted in his journal, with distances and landmarks that would allow him to find them again, even if fresh snow obscured his tracks. The systematic approach required more initial effort than the haphazard methods employed by many trappers, but Ezekiel knew from experience that the investment would pay dividends in efficiency over the course of the season. As the short winter day began to fade, Ezekiel made camp in a protected hollow, building a small hot fire that produced little smoke, another practice he'd developed that differed from the roaring blazes other men preferred. Heat close to the ground stays with you longer, he'd tried explaining once to Thorpe and his companions. They'd dismissed this advice too, preferring the momentary comfort of larger flames to the sustained warmth of a well-managed fire. As he huddled in his shelter that night, the temperature dropping well below zero, Ezekiel wondered again if his measured, careful approach to frontier life would ever earn the respect of men who valued spectacle over substance. The following day brought even harsher conditions, a bitter wind that drove fine snow into every exposed crevice and made setting traps a test of endurance. Lesser men might have abandoned their efforts, seeking the comfort of settlement until conditions improved. But Ezekiel persisted, his hands protected by layered mittens of his own design, leather outers over wool inners that could be removed separately when dexterity was needed. It was another small innovation born of observation and necessity, unremarkable in isolation, but part of a broader pattern of continuous improvement that characterized Ezekiel's approach to frontier challenges. By the 3rd day, all 30 traps were positioned according to plan, creating a circuit that Ezekiel could check efficiently every other day. The system required disciplined adherence to schedule, regardless of weather or difficulty, but would ensure that no animal suffered unnecessarily in a trap, and no opportunity was lost due to neglect. It was, like all of Ezekiel's methods, a balance of practical necessity and ethical consideration. The return journey to his homestead was arduous, the trail partially obscured by fresh snow and the temperature dropping further as darkness approached. Yet Ezekiel maintained the steady pace that had become his trademark, conserving energy and focusing on each step rather than the distance ahead. It was, he reflected, as the lights of settlement finally appeared through the trees, another example of the frontier philosophy he had developed over decades. Success came not from dramatic bursts of heroic effort, but from persistent, methodical progress toward well-defined goals. By the time Ezekiel returned to town 3 days later, he had set all 30 traps along a carefully planned route that would allow him to check each one every 2 days, half the time most trappers allowed between visits. The method meant more walking, but ensured that any caught animal would not suffer unnecessarily, and the fur would remain in prime condition. He recorded the location of each trap in a small leather-bound notebook, another practice the others considered needlessly meticulous. At Burkhart's, the usual crowd gathered to escape the cold and exchange news. Ezekiel ordered coffee and sat quietly at a corner table, listening to the others discuss their trapping plans. Most hadn't yet ventured out, citing the harsh conditions. "Planning to set out tomorrow if this cursed cold eases a bit," Jackson Thorpe announced, warming his hands around a mug of coffee. "Got my 20 new houses all cleaned and ready. Should be enough to bring in a good haul if the weather cooperates." "Already set my line," Ezekiel said quietly, not looking up from his coffee. The statement drew immediate attention. "In this weather?" Thorpe asked incredulously. "With those little contraptions of yours?" 30 traps along Beaver Creek and up toward the North Ridge," Ezekiel confirmed. "Set 3 days ago." Laughter rippled through the group. 30 of those toys won't catch what 5 real traps would," someone called out. "You're wasting your time, Harmon." Ezekiel simply nodded and finished his coffee. There was no point arguing. The season's results would speak for themselves. Later that evening, Ezekiel sat at his kitchen table reviewing his trap locations by lantern light. The small cabin he'd built 18 years earlier wasn't fancy, just 2 rooms with a lean-to workshop attached, but it was meticulously constructed with tight-fitting logs and carefully planned ventilation that kept it warmer than many larger homes in the area. Like his traps, the cabin reflected Ezekiel's belief that thoughtful design mattered more than scale or appearance. A knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Opening it, he was surprised to find Marcus Weber, a young man who had moved to the area only the previous spring. At 22, Marcus was still learning the harsh realities of frontier life, his enthusiasm sometimes outpacing his practical knowledge. "Evening, Mr. Harmon," the young man said, stamping snow from his boots. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Ezekiel replied, gesturing him inside. "What brings you out on a night like this?" Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard at Burkhart's that you'd set a trap line already. I was wondering, that is, I was hoping you might be willing to show me how it's done. I tried last month with some new houses I bought, but I didn't have any luck." Ezekiel studied the young man thoughtfully. Unlike Thorpe and the others who dismissed innovation in favor of tradition, Marcus showed a willingness to learn that was refreshing. "I'm checking my line day after tomorrow," he said finally. "You're welcome to join me if you're prepared for a long walk in this cold." The gratitude on Marcus's face confirmed Ezekiel's decision. Perhaps the next generation would be more receptive to new ideas than the current one had proven to be. 2 days later, before dawn, Marcus arrived at Ezekiel's cabin dressed in layers of wool and leather that Ezekiel immediately recognized as inadequate for the conditions they would face. Without comment, he provided the young man with additional gear from his own stores, an extra wool scarf, properly layered mittens, and gaiters to keep snow out of his boots. Each item was accompanied by a brief explanation of its purpose and proper use. Lessons delivered not as criticism, but as practical information. The day that followed was an education for both men. Marcus learned the principles behind Ezekiel's systematic approach to trapping, the careful selection of locations, the importance of understanding animal behavior, the efficiency of lightweight equipment, and the ethical considerations that informed his methods. Ezekiel, for his part, found unexpected satisfaction in sharing knowledge that others had typically dismissed. The results of the first check were modest but promising: 3 marten and a fox, all caught cleanly with minimal damage to the valuable pelts. Marcus watched in amazement as Ezekiel quickly processed each catch, his movements efficient and respectful. "You treat them differently than other trappers I've seen," Marcus observed, as Ezekiel carefully prepared the fox pelt for transport back to his cabin. "An animal that provides for my livelihood deserves respect," Ezekiel replied simply. "Waste or carelessness dishonors both the creature and the trapper." It was a philosophy that extended beyond his treatment of caught animals to encompass his entire approach to frontier living. The careful stewardship of resources, the minimization of waste, and the continuous refinement of methods to achieve better results with less effort and impact. These weren't abstract principles for Ezekiel, but practical guidelines that had served him well through decades of frontier challenges. As they continued along the trap line, checking each location and resetting as needed, Ezekiel shared observations accumulated over years of careful attention: how different animals moved through the landscape, how weather affected their patterns, and how understanding these factors could improve trapping success while reducing unnecessary suffering. Marcus absorbed the information eagerly, asking questions that revealed a genuine interest in learning rather than merely copying techniques. By the end of the day, with all 30 traps checked and reset, the two men had developed an unexpected rapport. In Marcus, Ezekiel saw something of himself as a younger man, curious, willing to question established methods, and open to innovation. In Ezekiel, Marcus found a mentor whose knowledge went beyond specific techniques to encompass a broader philosophy of frontier living that balanced practical necessity with ethical consideration. "I appreciate you taking the time," Marcus said as they approached Ezekiel's cabin in the fading light. "I've learned more today than in months of trying on my own." "Knowledge shared improves with the sharing," Ezekiel replied, the closest he would come to acknowledging the satisfaction he'd found in the day's companionship. The pattern established that day continued through the early weeks of the trapping season. Every other day, Marcus would join Ezekiel on his rounds, gradually taking more responsibility for checking and resetting traps under Ezekiel's watchful guidance. The young man proved an apt pupil, quickly grasping the principles behind Ezekiel's methods and applying them with increasing skill. What neither man anticipated was the impact their partnership would have on the broader community. Marcus, unlike Ezekiel, was socially integrated with the younger trappers and hunters of the region. As his success improved under Ezekiel's tutelage, others began to take notice, and Marcus freely attributed his results to what he was learning from the older man. Gradually, curiosity began to overcome prejudice, and questions about Ezekiel's methods started to replace dismissive mockery at gatherings in Burkhart's. 2 weeks later, as December gave way to January, the true brutality of the winter revealed itself. Snow fell in endless succession, and temperatures rarely climbed above 5 below zero. Trap lines became increasingly difficult to maintain, and many hunters abandoned their more distant sets rather than risk the journey to check them. Ezekiel, however, meticulously maintained his schedule, trudging through deep snow to visit each of his 30 traps every other day. The effort was proving worthwhile. By mid-January, while other trappers complained of poor results, Ezekiel had harvested 17 marten, 12 mink, 8 fox, and various smaller fur-bearers. His lightweight traps, initially dismissed as ineffective, were proving extraordinarily efficient. The quick-action mechanism caught animals cleanly without damaging the fur, and the lighter weight meant he could place them in locations other trappers couldn't easily reach. Marcus, who continued to accompany Ezekiel on most of his rounds, had begun experimenting with a trapline of his own, using 3 of Ezekiel's handmade stop thief models alongside traditional new houses for comparison. The results confirmed what Ezekiel had long maintained. The innovative design consistently outperformed its heavier, more complicated competitors. The partnership between the two men had evolved as well. No longer simply mentor and student, they had begun collaborating on refinements to the trap design, with Marcus's fresh perspective complementing Ezekiel's years of experience. Each iteration brought small improvements: a more sensitive trigger, a more secure closure, a more durable spring, incremental changes that reflected the continuous improvement philosophy at the heart of Ezekiel's approach. One evening in late January, as they sat at Ezekiel's kitchen table working on adjustments to the trigger mechanism, Marcus asked a question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Have you ever thought about making these traps for others to use? There would be good money in it, especially given the results they produce." Ezekiel looked up from the metal component he was filing, genuine surprise on his face. "Never occurred to me," he admitted. "They were just a solution to problems I was facing. Problems other trappers face too, whether they admit it or not," Marcus pointed out. "And your solution works better than anything I've seen. Seems a shame to keep it to ourselves." The suggestion planted a seed that would grow in unexpected ways in the months to come, but its immediate effect was to prompt Ezekiel to consider for the first time that his innovation might have value beyond his own trapline. It was a perspective shift that reflected the influence of his younger companion. Where Ezekiel saw practical solutions to immediate challenges, Marcus saw broader possibilities. The first indications that something unusual was happening came in late January at the weekly gathering at Burkhart's. Trappers compared their season's results, and the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. While most reported disappointing catches, 5 or 6 prime furs at most, Ezekiel quietly mentioned that he'd already collected over 40 high-quality pelts. "Impossible," Jackson Thorpe declared flatly. "No man's having that kind of success in this weather." "You can see for yourself," Ezekiel offered. "I've got them properly stretched and drying in my workshop." The next day, a delegation of skeptical trappers arrived at Ezekiel's homestead. The sight that greeted them in his workshop silenced even the most vocal critics. Dozens of perfectly preserved pelts hung from the rafters, each one showing the clean catch that came from Ezekiel's innovative trap design. The evidence was undeniable. His toy traps were outperforming the traditional models by a substantial margin. "How?" Thorpe finally asked, genuine curiosity replacing his usual derision. Ezekiel walked them through his methodology, explaining how the lightweight design allowed for more traps to be set, how the quick-action mechanism prevented animals from escaping or damaging the fur, and how his meticulous record-keeping ensured no trap went unchecked for too long. "It's not about the strength of the trap," he concluded. "It's about understanding the behavior of what you're trying to catch and designing accordingly." For most of the visitors, the demonstration was merely an interesting novelty, something to discuss at Burkhart's but not a reason to change established practices. But for a few, including surprisingly Jackson Thorpe himself, it planted seeds of doubt about methods they had never questioned. These seeds would germinate slowly over the weeks to come, nurtured by the continuing disparity in results between Ezekiel's approach and their own. The revelation might have ended there, a local trapper's innovation gaining grudging respect from his peers, but for the arrival of Morris Gilman, a traveling fur buyer with connections to markets in Chicago and New York. Gilman had been making the winter circuit through northern Minnesota for 15 years, and he recognized the exceptional quality of Ezekiel's furs immediately. "These are some of the finest pelts I've seen in years," he declared, examining a particularly impressive marten. "Clean catches, no damage to the fur. How are you managing this in such harsh conditions?" When Ezekiel demonstrated his trap design, Gilman's interest was immediate and intense. "Have you considered manufacturing these, Go?" he asked. "There's a market for a trap that produces results like this." The question caught Ezekiel off guard. He'd created his stop thief trap to solve his own problems, not as a commercial venture. But Gilman was persuasive, outlining the potential for a lightweight, effective trap that could revolutionize the industry. By the end of the meeting, preliminary arrangements had been made for Gilman to show the design to contacts in Chicago who might be interested in production. As February deepened the winter's grip, word of Ezekiel's innovative trap spread through the county. Trappers who had once mocked his toy now approached him for advice, or in some cases, to purchase one of his handmade models. The sudden attention was uncomfortable for a man who had spent most of his life working quietly and methodically, but Ezekiel recognized the opportunity to improve trapping practices beyond his own line. Jackson Thorpe was among the last to approach him, pride making the conversation difficult. "Heard Gilman's taking your design east," he said gruffly. "Seems I might have been hasty in my judgment." "We all have different ways of solving problems," Ezekiel replied, unwilling to dwell on past slights. "Would you like to see how they work?" The unlikely partnership that formed, Ezekiel teaching Thorpe his methods, Thorpe offering insights from his own years of experience, benefited both men. By season's end, Thorpe had modified his approach, incorporating elements of Ezekiel's systematic methodology while maintaining his own strengths as a woodsman. His results improved dramatically, though he never quite matched Ezekiel's remarkable efficiency. The winter trapping season concluded in early March with Ezekiel's most successful harvest on record. 73 prime furs that brought top prices from buyers who had begun to associate his name with exceptional quality. The financial windfall was welcome, but secondary to the satisfaction of seeing his methods validated and his innovation recognized. For a man who had spent decades being quietly right, while others were confidently wrong, the acknowledgment carried its own reward. Marcus, who had continued his apprenticeship throughout the season, had amassed a respectable collection of furs himself, enough to finance the small homestead he hoped to establish in the spring. More importantly, he had absorbed not just the technical aspects of Ezekiel's approach, but the underlying philosophy of careful observation, continuous improvement, and ethical conduct that informed it. In the young man, Ezekiel saw the continuation of a way of thinking about frontier challenges that prioritized adaptation over force, preparation over reaction, and systematic methodology over trial and error. In March, as the first hints of thaw appeared, Morris Gilman returned to Clearwater County with news. A manufacturing firm in Chicago had expressed serious interest in the stop thief trap, offering Ezekiel a generous arrangement to secure the rights to his design. The terms included not only an initial payment, but ongoing compensation for each trap sold, a rare acknowledgment of an inventor's continued stake in his creation. The decision wasn't easy. Ezekiel had never sought wealth or recognition, preferring the quiet satisfaction of solving practical problems. But he recognized that his design could improve the work of trappers throughout the region, making their difficult profession more efficient and humane. After careful consideration, he agreed to the terms, with one additional stipulation, that the traps be manufactured to the exact specifications he had developed without compromise to reduce costs. The transaction marked a turning point in Ezekiel's relationship with the broader community. The substantial payment he received, more money than he had earned in the previous 5 years combined, elevated his status in ways that his practical innovations never had. Suddenly, the methods that had been dismissed as excessive caution or unnecessary fussing were reinterpreted as the wisdom of a man whose ideas had proven valuable enough to interest Eastern manufacturers. It was a reminder, not lost on Ezekiel, of how easily perception could be influenced by external validation. Spring brought its own challenges to Clearwater County. The heavy winter snowfall, melting rapidly under unseasonably warm April sunshine, transformed creeks into torrents and low-lying areas into swamps. Several homesteads situated too close to waterways suffered significant flooding, with families forced to abandon their homes until conditions improved. The community rallied to provide shelter and assistance, but the crisis highlighted once again the importance of foresight in frontier living. Ezekiel's own homestead, deliberately sited on a gentle slope well above any potential flood level, remained dry and secure. It was another example of his methodical approach to frontier challenges. The selection of his property had been preceded by careful observation of drainage patterns through multiple seasons, consideration of soil types, and analysis of vegetation that indicated historical water levels. What some had seen as excessive caution when he declined seemingly favorable locations closer to water sources now appeared as prudent planning. As he helped neighbors salvage belongings from flooded cabins and rebuild damaged structures, Ezekiel found himself in the unfamiliar position of having his advice actively sought rather than politely tolerated. The success of his trap design had established a credibility that extended to other areas of frontier expertise, and he shared his knowledge freely, offering practical suggestions for rebuilding in ways that would better withstand future floods. It was during this period of community recovery that Ezekiel's partnership with Marcus evolved further. The young man, having learned the fundamentals of Ezekiel's trapping methods, now sought guidance on establishing his own homestead. With the proceeds from his fur sales and savings from previous work, Marcus had acquired a promising piece of land 5 miles north of town, but he was wise enough to recognize his inexperience in the critical decisions that would determine his success or failure. Ezekiel, who had never married or had children of his own, found unexpected satisfaction in mentoring the younger man. Together they surveyed the property, identifying the optimal location for a cabin based on drainage, sun exposure, and protection from prevailing winds. They discussed construction techniques that would maximize efficiency and durability while minimizing materials cost, another area where Ezekiel's innovations had produced results that defied conventional wisdom. Most men build too large and too quickly, he explained as they staked out the foundation for what would become Marcus's first permanent structure. Better to start small, but solid, with room to expand as time and resources allow. A well-built cabin half the size will keep you warmer and drier than a hastily constructed larger one. It was the kind of practical advice that characterized all of Ezekiel's teaching, grounded in experience, focused on tangible outcomes rather than appearances, and often counter to prevailing practices. And like his trap design, it reflected a fundamental philosophy that valued thoughtful adaptation over brute force approaches to frontier challenges. By the following winter, the first production run of Harmon Stop Thief traps reached Burkhart's General Store in Clearwater County. They sold out within 2 days, with orders placed for 3 times as many. Trappers who had once ridiculed Ezekiel's innovation now paid premium prices for the manufactured version, having seen the results firsthand. For Ezekiel himself, the sudden prosperity brought modest changes to his life. He expanded his workshop and hired 2 apprentices to help with his carpentry business, but otherwise maintained the same methodical, prepared approach to frontier living that had served him well for decades. The respect of his peers, so long withheld, was worth more to him than the money his invention generated. One significant change was the increasing frequency with which other innovators sought his advice. Word had spread beyond trapping circles that Ezekiel Harmon had successfully translated a homemade solution into a commercially viable product, and others with ideas of their own wanted to understand how he had navigated the process. Ezekiel shared what he had learned freely, helping several local inventors refine their designs and connect with potential manufacturers. It was another form of the knowledge sharing that had become increasingly important to him in the years since his partnership with Marcus began. Marcus himself had completed his cabin by late summer and was now focused on preparing for his first winter as an independent homesteader. The structure reflected many of Ezekiel's principles, compact but efficiently designed, with careful attention to insulation, ventilation, and heat retention. Like his mentor, Marcus had prioritized thorough preparation over haste, accumulating supplies and firewood well beyond what others might have considered necessary. The approach drew some of the same gentle mockery that Ezekiel had endured for years, but Marcus, confident in the wisdom he had absorbed, simply continued his methodical preparations. As autumn painted the forests in shades of gold and crimson, Ezekiel and Marcus embarked on an experimental venture that combined their shared interest in innovation with the practical demands of the approaching winter. Together they designed and built a modified food storage cellar that incorporated several novel features: a ventilation system that prevented freezing while maintaining cold temperatures, elevated storage platforms that protected supplies from potential flooding, and a specialized root vegetable storage section with controlled humidity. The project exemplified the continuous improvement philosophy that had become central to their approach to frontier challenges. Each component was tested, refined, and retested before final implementation, with careful documentation of successes and failures to inform future iterations. It was an approach that required more initial investment of time and thought than the trial-and-error methods common on the frontier, but that ultimately produced more reliable results with less waste of resources. The true significance of Ezekiel's innovation became apparent in the years that followed. The Harmon stop thief trap represented a shift in thinking about resource management on the frontier. Its efficiency meant fewer traps needed to be set to achieve the same results, reducing the pressure on fur-bearer populations. Its humane design minimized suffering, addressing concerns that were beginning to emerge about traditional trapping methods. Most importantly, it embodied the frontier virtue of thoughtful preparation over hasty action. Ezekiel had spent years observing, thinking, and carefully refining his design, while others relied on brute force approaches handed down without question. His success demonstrated that innovation could emerge from patient, methodical work rather than dramatic gestures or displays of strength. By 1916, the Harmon stop thief trap had become standard equipment for trappers throughout the Northern Territories, its reputation for reliability and efficiency firmly established. Ezekiel himself had become something of a reluctant local legend, sought out by young trappers and hunters for advice that went beyond equipment to encompass his entire philosophy of frontier living. "The wilderness doesn't reward those who challenge it with force," he would tell them, echoing wisdom that had taken him decades to fully understand. "It rewards those who observe, adapt, and prepare." The principle was demonstrated most dramatically during a forest fire that swept through parts of Clearwater County in the dry summer of 1917. The blaze, started by lightning and fueled by unusually dry conditions, threatened several outlying homesteads, including Marcus's relatively new establishment. While many fought the approaching flames with desperate last-minute efforts, digging fire breaks and wetting structures with inadequate water supplies, Marcus implemented a defense plan he and Ezekiel had developed months earlier, after observing the dangerous buildup of dry underbrush in the surrounding forest. The approach involved multiple concentric zones of protection: an outer area where underbrush had been systematically cleared, a middle zone where trees were widely spaced and lower branches removed, and an inner perimeter of fireproof material surrounding the cabin and outbuildings. Additionally, Marcus had constructed a small reservoir that captured and stored rainwater specifically for fire defense, with a simple pump system that could deliver it where needed. When the fire approached, these preparations proved decisive. While other homesteaders battled flames with improvised tools and limited water, Marcus was able to focus his efforts on spot fires in the inner zone, preventing them from taking hold and spreading. His property emerged largely unscathed, while others suffered significant damage despite heroic efforts to save them. It was a vivid illustration of the principle that Ezekiel had tried for years to instill. That systematic preparation before a crisis almost always proves more effective than reactive measures during one. The severe winter of 1918 brought this lesson into sharp relief. Record-breaking cold and snow isolated many homesteads for weeks at a time, and food supplies dwindled dangerously. Families who had followed conventional wisdom about winter preparation, storing what seemed like ample provisions based on average conditions, found themselves rationing severely by February. Ezekiel, however, had prepared differently. His storehouse contained nearly twice the supplies others considered necessary, carefully preserved and organized. His woodpile, a source of good-natured teasing for its excessive size, now provided vital heat while others scrambled for fuel. And his innovative trap design allowed him to harvest game efficiently, even in the harshest conditions, supplementing dwindling supplies. Marcus, following the principles he had learned from his mentor, found himself similarly well-positioned to weather the crisis. His first independent winter as a homesteader, which might have proven disastrous for a less prepared individual, instead became a validation of the methodical approach he had adopted. His carefully designed storage cellar kept vegetables and preserves from freezing. His strategic placement of wood stockpiles meant fuel remained accessible despite deep snow. And his efficient cabin design maintained comfort with minimal heating requirements. As conditions worsened, Ezekiel's homestead became a refuge for neighbors in need. Without fanfare or judgment, he shared what he had prepared, helping several families through the worst of the crisis. Jackson Thorpe, whose own preparations had proved inadequate, spent 2 weeks at Ezekiel's table, the final barriers of pride between the two men dissolving in the face of practical necessity. "I've been thinking about what you said years ago about 3 sets to 1, Thorpe admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "It wasn't just about the traps, was it?" "No," Ezekiel agreed. "It's about understanding that preparation isn't wasted effort. It's the difference between thriving and merely surviving when conditions turn against you." The winter of 1918 passed into local memory as one of exceptional hardship, but it also marked a turning point in how the community approached frontier living. The lessons of Ezekiel's methodical preparation spread beyond trapping to influence how families stored food, built structures, and planned for adversity. His once mocked practices became standard recommendations passed down to newcomers. In the spring of 1920, Ezekiel received notification that the 100,000th Harmon-Stop thief trap had been manufactured, a milestone that came with a special commemorative model and a letter of appreciation from the company. The trap that had once been dismissed as a toy had proven its worth across the continent, changing practices that had remained unquestioned for generations. For Ezekiel, now in his 65th year, the recognition was satisfying but secondary to the knowledge that his work had contributed something of lasting value to frontier life. The true measure of his achievement wasn't in units sold or profits earned, but in the shift toward more thoughtful, efficient practices that his innovation had helped catalyze. The following years brought both continuity and change to Clearwater County. The region remained primarily rural, but improvements in transportation and communication gradually reduced its isolation. New settlers arrived with different expectations and approaches to frontier challenges, while established families adapted traditional practices to incorporate new technologies and methods. Through it all, Ezekiel's innovative spirit continued to find expression in a steady stream of practical improvements to everyday frontier tasks. One particularly successful creation was a modified hand-powered washing machine that dramatically reduced the labor involved in a task that consumed hours of valuable time each week. The design, which Ezekiel developed in collaboration with several local women who actually performed the work, another departure from conventional practice, incorporated insights gained from careful observation of the washing process and identification of its most physically demanding components. The machine never achieved the commercial success of his trap design, but it significantly improved quality of life for families throughout the region who built their own versions based on plans Ezekiel freely shared. It exemplified his approach to innovation, identifying genuine problems through observation, developing solutions through methodical experimentation, and sharing results to benefit the broader community. By 1923, Marcus had established himself as a successful homesteader and trapper in his own right. His property expanded to include additional acreage and several well-constructed outbuildings. He had married Sarah Thompson, the daughter of a neighboring family, and their first child was due in the spring. The young man who had sought Ezekiel's guidance on trapping techniques years earlier had become a respected community member, known for his reliable judgment and innovative solutions to frontier challenges. The relationship between the two men had evolved from mentor and student to that of close friends and occasional collaborators. They still worked together on projects of mutual interest, but Marcus now contributed his own insights and innovations to their shared enterprises. It was exactly the outcome Ezekiel had hoped for, not the creation of a disciple who would blindly follow his methods, but the development of an independent thinker who would build upon and ultimately surpass what he had been taught. In 1926, when a journalist from a St. Paul newspaper traveled to Clearwater County to interview the inventor of the famous trap for a special feature on Minnesota innovations, he found Ezekiel still living simply in the same homestead, still working carefully in his expanded workshop. When asked what advice he would give to young people facing their own frontier challenges, Ezekiel considered the question carefully before responding. The frontier rewards those who listen more than they speak, who observe more than they act, and who prepare more than they boast, he said. Innovation isn't about dramatic gestures. It's about solving real problems through patient work and careful thought. These words were published in the St. Paul Pioneer Press on October 12, 1926, and clipped for preservation in the Clearwater County Historical Society's archives. They captured the essence of a frontier wisdom that transcended specific inventions or techniques to encompass a broader philosophy about human interaction with challenging environments. The article sparked renewed interest in Ezekiel's work, bringing visitors from as far away as Chicago and New York who hoped to learn from his approach to frontier innovation. Among them was Dr. William Chambers, a professor of agricultural engineering from the University of Minnesota, who was particularly impressed by the systematic methodology underlying Ezekiel's various inventions. "What strikes me about Mr. Harmon's work," Chambers later wrote in a departmental publication, "is not just the cleverness of his solutions, but the rigorous process by which he arrives at them. His approach, careful observation, methodical experimentation, and continuous refinement embody scientific principles that many formally trained engineers would do well to emulate." The recognition from academic circles was gratifying to Ezekiel, who had never received formal education beyond elementary school. It validated his belief that practical knowledge derived from direct experience, systematically analyzed and applied, was no less valuable than theoretical understanding acquired through formal study. This perspective would influence educational approaches in practical fields for decades to come, as institutions began to recognize the importance of hands-on problem-solving alongside theoretical instruction. In his final years, Ezekiel found deep satisfaction in mentoring a new generation of innovators. The workshop behind his cabin became an informal gathering place for young people with ideas and questions, a place where practical problems were dissected and potential solutions subjected to rigorous analysis. Some of the innovations that emerged from these sessions, improvements to agricultural implements, modifications to building techniques, refinements to food preservation methods, spread throughout the region, each one carrying forward Ezekiel's philosophy of thoughtful adaptation to frontier challenges. Ezekiel Harmon passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1931, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond the trap that bore his name. His workshop, with its meticulous organization and innovative tools, was preserved as part of the county historical collection. His notebooks, filled with observations and designs, provided insights into a mind that had always sought better ways to solve practical problems. But perhaps his most significant legacy was less tangible, a shift in how frontier communities valued different forms of knowledge and preparation. The Harmon Principle, as it came to be known locally, emphasized thoughtful innovation over tradition, careful preparation over dramatic action, and quiet competence over showmanship. It influenced practices in hunting, farming, construction, and community planning throughout the region, often without explicit attribution to its source. Marcus, who had become something of a surrogate son to Ezekiel in his later years, ensured that his mentor's approach to frontier challenges would not be forgotten. In addition to preserving Ezekiel's notebooks and tools, he documented the underlying principles that had informed the older man's innovations. These materials became the foundation for what would eventually become the Clearwater County Innovation Center, a facility dedicated to preserving and promoting the problem-solving methodology Ezekiel had developed through decades of frontier experience. The center, established in 1938 with funding from the company that still manufactured the Harmon Stop Thief Trap, served as both museum and educational resource. Visitors could see examples of Ezekiel's various inventions, from the famous trap to lesser-known but equally ingenious solutions to everyday frontier challenges. More importantly, they could learn about the systematic approach to problem-solving that had produced these innovations, a methodology that emphasized careful observation, methodical experimentation, and continuous refinement. For young people growing up in the region during the challenging years of the Great Depression, the center offered practical guidance that extended beyond specific techniques to encompass a broader philosophy of self-reliance and resourcefulness. Many would later credit Harmon thinking, the methodical approach to identifying and solving practical problems, with helping their families weather economic hardship through innovative adaptation of available resources. In 1952, when an engineer from the Minnesota Department of Conservation discovered one of the original handmade stop thief traps in the Clearwater County Museum, he was struck by how many of its design principles had been incorporated into modern equipment without acknowledgement of their origin. The efficient use of materials, the careful balance of strength and weight, the emphasis on humane function, all had become standard considerations in equipment design, their radical nature forgotten as they became conventional wisdom. The engineer arranged for the original trap to be photographed and documented, ensuring that Ezekiel's contribution would not be entirely lost to history. His report, filed in the state archives, noted that Harmon's innovation represents not merely a mechanical improvement, but a philosophical shift in how frontier challenges were approached, from confrontation to thoughtful adaptation. Today, few remember the name Ezekiel Harmon or recognize the significance of his toy trap that outperformed its burlier competitors. But his approach, careful observation, efficient design, and thorough preparation, has become embedded in the practices and attitudes that define responsible resource management and frontier resilience. The frontier that Ezekiel knew has long since disappeared, transformed by development and technology. But the moral of his story, that preparation trumps bravado, that innovation often comes from careful observation rather than dramatic gestures, and that true frontier wisdom lies in adaptation rather than confrontation, remains as relevant as ever to those facing new frontiers of their own. In the end, the legacy of the toy trap that caught more game than all the others combined isn't about trapping at all. It's about the quiet triumph of methodical problem-solving over tradition-bound thinking and the enduring value of preparation in the face of uncertainty. It's a lesson written not in grand proclamations, but in the practical details of frontier survival, a lesson as vital today as it was when Ezekiel first filed that notch in his revolutionary design in the winter of 1908.